I got a text earlier this morning from my wife, who of course teaches high school freshmen and sophomores. And so she's teaching a group of kids who were born after 9/11, have no memory of it whatsoever. And even at the high school level, even those who were born before or during 9/11 weren't old enough to really remember it. So the next generation of children really have no recollection of 9/11, and she was commenting on how sad it is that they don't really understand what a tragedy it was. And there is something to that. I think that that's true of every generation that comes along. There is some tragedy in the past that separates the generations that we might not have an understanding of because we didn't live through it. Something like the Kennedy assassination, which my parents remember very, very clearly because they were alive during it, but that I, of course, don't because I was born 20-odd years later. And I think 9/11, I've always felt that that was kind of the dividing point between my generation, the Millennials, and the generation after mine, the Post-Millennials or Generation Z. I've always felt that it was about how clearly you remember the event itself. If you remember 9/11 pretty clearly to the point that you basically understood what was happening, even if you didn't necessarily understand why, then you are on the millennial side of the divide, whereas if you are not old enough to remember it at all, or you only have very fuzzy memories of people being scared, or you were born after the event, then you would be on the Generation Z side of the divide. But I've been thinking about it a little bit more lately, and I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. It's not so much whether you remember the event itself, but whether or not you can remember what the world was like before 9/11. Like, if you can draw a clear distinction in your life between the world before 9/11 and the world after 9/11, then you would be on the millennial side. But if you really only remember a post-9/11 world, then you're on Generation Z. Actually, it occurred to me just a few minutes ago that I was 17 years old almost when 9/11 happened, and it has been 17 years since it happened, which means that I am evenly split between how much of my life I've lived in a pre-9/11 world and how much of my life I've lived in a post-9/11 world. And I do think that this is an important distinction to make because I think it kind of factors into the path of our political discourse today. Every presidential election that I've ever voted in, which is since 2004, I remember it as just being a steady stream of just like vitriol and tension and, you know, hurling these insults at the other side and basically this post-apocalyptic mindset where you paint the other side as being the absolute enemy. They're evil. They're going to mark the end of this country and our way of life. They're going to turn our democracy into a fascist dictatorship. And I don't have like real clear memories of elections before 9/11. And maybe they were the same way, but I feel like just having lived through what was in many ways an apocalypse of sorts kind of gave us that mindset as we were picking our leaders in the years following. But I feel like that excessive use of the hyperbole kind of in its own way led to the election of Donald Trump, because I feel like a lot of people who were maybe on the fence about Trump kind of looked at the things that were being said against him, that he was going to be a horrible president, that he was going to be completely incompetent and mark the end of the democracy and be a legitimate danger to our country and our way of life. They kind of looked at that and basically said, yeah, but you said that about Mitt Romney. But I think in a lot of ways this kind of political bickering comes from a sense of idealism, and specifically idealism for a period of time that never really existed. We often talk about baby boomers and how they are trying to return the world to what they remember from the 50s, and kind of this sort of nostalgic, idealistic way that they look at their childhood and what the world was like in the 50s, regardless of whether it was actually like that, and how they're basically trying to move the world back to that time period. And I do think there's a fair amount of truth to that, but I also think that millennials are kind of guilty of this as well, except we're not trying to return to the world of the 50s, we're trying to return to the pre-9/11 world that we remember from our childhood, the world of the 90s, which we also remember in kind of a nostalgic and idealistic way, and which also was not nearly as idealistic and idyllic as we remember it being. But then you look at the post-millennials, the Generation Z, and you look at how a group of young people might be able to change the nature of the political discourse simply by the fact that they don't have any nostalgic feelings for a pre-9/11 world because they never lived in a pre-9/11 world. They don't remember a pre-9/11 world. All they know is this world, the post-9/11 world. And I think that has given them a much more pragmatic approach to solving problems. I think they're able to look at an issue, whatever it might be, and basically say, here's a problem that needs to be solved. Let's find the most effective way to solve it. One of the big ways you can see this already happening is in the gun control debate. Post-millennials have really kind of taken on the gun control debate as their issue, largely because I think they just kind of looked and said, we need to solve this problem more than any other problem because it's literally killing us. And I have actually a great deal of hope that that attitude, that more pragmatic approach to solving problems and changing the nature of the political debate might actually work as more and more of these post-millennials, this Generation Z, gets to be of voting age and gets to be at an age where their voices will more and more so be heard. And so, yeah, Generation Z will never understand 9/11 the way I do. They probably won't feel compelled to do a retrospective every single year for VEDS or for whatever because they actually lived through it, because they didn't live through it and it doesn't have as much of an impact on them. But I think in the long run, that might actually be a good thing. I think in the long run, because even though they don't remember 9/11, they're still affected by it, and I think they're aware that they're affected by it. And I think that more than anything is going to allow them to rise up and really help to change the nature of the political debate. At least I hope so. So that's my 9/11 ramble for this year. And until next time, friends and fellow VEDSies, I'll see you tomorrow.